boring history for sleep, the surprisingly ordinary life of a colonial American post rider. Tonight we travel back to a quieter America, not to a battlefield, not to a famous president's mansion, not to a dramatic revolution. Instead, we will follow a man whose name has largely been forgotten. He carried letters, day after day, year after year, across muddy roads, forests, rivers, and small settlements that would eventually become towns and cities. His work was slow, predictable, and incredibly important. So settle in, relax, and let your mind drift as we explore the surprisingly ordinary life of a colonial American post rider. In the early 18th century, the American colonies stretched along the eastern coastline of North America. Most people lived close to the Atlantic Ocean. Beyond the settlements lay vast forests, rolling hills, and land that seemed endless. Travel was difficult. Roads were often little more than dirt paths cut through the wilderness. After rain, they became deep fields of mud. In winter, they could disappear beneath snow and ice. Yet messages still needed to move from one colony to another. Merchants needed information about shipments. Government officials needed reports. Families wanted news from distant relatives. And so the colonies relied on post riders. A post rider was exactly what the name suggests. A person on horseback carrying mail. The work sounds simple, but simplicity often hides endless repetition. A rider might wake before sunrise. The air would be cold and damp. The horse would need feeding. Saddlebags would need inspection. Letters would be sorted. Packages secured. Only then could the day's journey begin. The rider would mount the horse and start down a rough road. The pace was usually steady. Not fast, not slow, just enough to cover distance without exhausting the animal. Hours would pass. Trees lined the road. Birds called from the branches. Wheels from passing wagons left deep ruts in the ground. The rider saw much of the same scenery every day. A farmhouse, a creek, a bridge, another farmhouse, another creek, another bridge, then more forest, and more road. The colonies did not have a modern postal system. Routes existed, but schedules were flexible. Weather often dictated everything. A heavy storm could delay mail for days. Flooded rivers might force long detours. Winter snow created entirely new challenges. Imagine riding for hours while icy wind cuts across open fields. Imagine trying to protect stacks of letters from freezing rain. Imagine reaching a settlement only to discover the next road is completely blocked. Such inconveniences were normal. Nobody considered them unusual. In many places, taverns served as informal post offices. A rider would arrive, hand over letters, collect new ones, eat a simple meal, and continue onward. The tavern keeper might know everyone in the community. He knew who expected mail, who had family in another colony, who owed money to merchants, who subscribed to newspapers. Information moved slowly, because people expected slowness. A letter from one colony to another could take weeks, sometimes longer. Patience was not a virtue. It was a necessity. A typical rider's clothing reflected practicality rather than fashion. Heavy boots protected the feet. A wool coat provided warmth. A broad-brimmed hat offered shelter from sun and rain. The outfit was not elegant, but elegance was not the goal. The goal was arriving at the next stop. The horse deserved just as much attention as the rider. Without the horse, the entire system stopped. Animals required food, water, rest, and care. A wise rider paid close attention to signs of fatigue. An exhausted horse could not continue. In some locations, riders changed horses at designated stations. Fresh animals allowed mail to keep moving. The process was routine. One horse arrived tired. Another horse departed rested. The letters continued their journey. And so did the rider. Many people today think history is filled with dramatic moments. Kings, wars, explorers, revolutions. Yet most historical life consisted of ordinary routines. The colonial postal service provides an excellent example. Thousands of journeys happened without remarkable events. No bandits appeared. No heroic rescues occurred. No famous speeches were delivered. A rider simply traveled from one settlement to another. Again, and again, and again. Over time, the roads slowly improved. Population increased. Settlements expanded. Commerce grew. More letters entered the system. More riders were needed. What began as a small network gradually became something larger. The mail connected distant communities. People who never met one another exchanged information through handwritten pages. Business agreements traveled in saddlebags. Family news crossed colonial borders. Newspapers spread ideas. Announcements spread opportunities. All through a system that relied heavily on patience and endurance. A rider might spend long stretches alone. Hours without conversation. Hours hearing only hoofbeats. Clip, clop, clip, clop. The rhythm became familiar, almost comforting. A steady sound accompanying a steady job. Many roads followed natural geography. Rivers suggested routes. Valleys guided travelers. Hills created obstacles. The landscape itself helped determine where people traveled. Long before modern highways, geography quietly shaped communication. Nightfall brought another routine. Find shelter. Care for the horse. Eat a meal. Check the mail. Sleep. Then repeat everything tomorrow. And the next day. And the day after that. For years. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about colonial post riders is how unremarkable they appeared. Most people never became famous. Most names disappeared from historical records. Yet their work mattered enormously. Without reliable communication, trade slows. Government struggles. Communities become isolated. The simple act of carrying letters helped hold together an expanding society. As the colonies moved closer toward the Revolutionary era, communication became even more important. Ideas traveled alongside ordinary correspondence. Newspapers circulated discussions of politics. Merchants exchanged information about regulations and taxes. Citizens learned about events occurring hundreds of miles away. The roads remained rough. The horses remained essential. The riders remained largely anonymous. But the flow of information continued. Year after year. Season after season. Summer heat. Autumn rain. Winter snow. Spring mud. The mail moved through them all. And now, as our journey through colonial America slowly comes to an end, imagine one final rider disappearing down a long dirt road. The sun hangs low over the horizon. The horse maintains its familiar pace. A leather saddlebag carries letters destined for people the rider will never truly know. The road stretches ahead. The forest stands quietly on either side. Nothing dramatic happens. Nothing extraordinary occurs. Only another mile. Then another. And another. A simple journey through a simpler time. The steady rhythm of hoofbeats fading into the distance. until they become quieter and quieter and quieter, and eventually disappear altogether. The forgotten life of an ordinary man in colonial America. Boring history for sleep. Before we begin, imagine a quiet morning. There are no cars, no phones, no televisions, no glowing screens in dark bedrooms. The year is 1732. The sun has not yet appeared above the forests of eastern Pennsylvania. A thin layer of mist rests over the fields. The world is quiet except for distant birds and the soft sound of wind moving through trees. Most people are still asleep. But not everyone. A farmer named Thomas Miller slowly opens his eyes. He is not famous. He will never become a president. He will never command an army. No history book will dedicate a chapter to his life. Yet people like Thomas made up most of America. Thousands upon thousands of ordinary men and women lived lives very similar to his. Their stories rarely survive. Tonight, we will follow one of them. Thomas sleeps on a straw mattress. Compared to modern beds, it is not especially comfortable. The mattress rests on a simple wooden frame built by local craftsmen. His blanket is made from wool. The room is cold. Colonial homes often felt chilly during much of the year. Heating an entire house was difficult. Most warmth came from fireplaces. As the fire died during the night, temperatures inside could become uncomfortable. Thomas slowly sits up. The room is dark. He does not check a clock. Most families do not own one. Instead, daily life follows the rhythms of nature. People rise when daylight approaches. They sleep when darkness arrives. The modern idea of staying awake past midnight for entertainment would seem strange to many colonists. Thomas places his feet on the wooden floor. The boards creak softly. His wife, Sarah, remains asleep nearby. Their youngest child is sleeping in another bed. The older children share a room. Large families are common. Children provide valuable labor on farms. Every pair of hands matters. Thomas quietly dresses. His clothing is simple. Nothing about it is fashionable by modern standards. His shirt is linen. His trousers are coarse wool. His shoes were made locally. Most clothing is expensive. People own fewer garments than modern Americans. A typical person may possess only a handful of outfits. Clothing is repaired repeatedly. Nothing is wasted if it can still be used. Thomas moves downstairs. The house smells faintly of smoke. Smoke is a constant companion in colonial life. Fireplaces burn nearly every day. Cooking, heating, and many household tasks depend upon fire. He kneels near the hearth. The previous night's embers are still warm. This is good news. Starting a completely new fire takes time and effort. Keeping embers alive overnight is often easier. He carefully adds small pieces of wood. Soon a flame begins to grow. The room slowly brightens. Outside, darkness still covers the fields. Thomas opens the door. Cool air enters the house. He steps outside. The ground is damp. Morning dew covers the grass. Above him, stars remain visible. Many colonial Americans see extraordinary night skies. Without electric lights, the heavens appear brighter than most modern people ever experience. The Milky Way stretches across the darkness. Thomas notices none of this with special wonder. For him, these sights are ordinary. They have always been there. He walks toward the barn. Animals must be cared for before anything else. Cows need milking. Horses need feed. Chickens require attention. Farm life operates according to necessity rather than convenience. Animals do not wait. As Thomas reaches the barn, he hears movement inside. The animals are already awake. The day has begun. And like countless ordinary days in colonial America, it will be filled with work. Work that is repetitive. Work that is necessary. Work that most history books never describe. Yet these quiet routines formed the foundation of early American society. And so, beneath the fading stars of a Pennsylvania morning, Thomas Miller begins another ordinary day. One of thousands. One of tens of thousands. A life almost forgotten by history, but not entirely, because tonight we will follow it slowly, very slowly, just as the people of colonial America once lived it. The Forgotten Life of an Ordinary Man in Colonial America. Part 2. Thomas stepped into the barn, while the sky remained dark blue and silver. The building was not large by modern standards. Most colonial farmers owned modest barns, carefully constructed from local timber. Every beam represented hours of labor. Every board required cutting, shaping, transporting, and fitting into place. Nothing came easily. Nothing arrived in a truck. Nothing could be ordered with the press of a button. The barn smelled of hay, animals, leather, and wood. To Thomas, these smells meant security. A healthy barn usually meant a healthy farm. And a healthy farm meant survival. Many modern people think about careers, investments, or retirement accounts when considering financial security. Colonial farmers thought about livestock. A cow could provide milk. A horse could pull equipment. Chickens could lay eggs. Animals represented wealth in a practical form. Thomas moved toward the family's dairy cow. She was calm. Like most mornings, she seemed to expect his arrival. Milking required patience. The process could not be rushed. Thomas sat on a small wooden stool. The barn remained mostly quiet, except for the occasional movement of animals and the distant sound of wind outside. Milk struck the bucket with a steady rhythm. The sound was soft, repetitive, almost soothing. For generations, millions of people around the world began their days in exactly this way. Long before factories, long before railroads, long before airplanes crossed oceans, human life often started with animals and agriculture. By the time Thomas finished, faint sunlight had begun to appear in the eastern sky. Outside, the forest was becoming visible. Pennsylvania still contained vast areas of woodland. Trees dominated much of the landscape. Many colonists spent enormous amounts of time cutting them down. Creating farmland required constant effort. A farmer might spend years clearing enough land to support his family. Stumps remained stubborn obstacles. Roots stretched deep underground. Axes became among the most important tools in colonial America. An experienced woodsman could identify dozens of different uses for different kinds of timber. Oak might become beams. Pine might become boards. Hickory could become tool handles. Nothing was wasted if it remained useful. Thomas carried the milk back toward the house. Smoke now rose from several neighboring farms. Across the countryside, other families were beginning their own mornings. Most of them followed routines very similar to his. Breakfast would soon be prepared. Animals would be fed. Fields would be inspected. Repairs would be made. Children would be assigned chores. The cycle repeated day after day, season after season, year after year. Inside the house, Sarah had already awakened. The fire burned more brightly now. Their eldest daughter was helping prepare breakfast. Children often worked from an early age. Modern childhood differs dramatically from colonial childhood. Many young people today spend years focused primarily on education. Colonial children learned through labor. Boys and girls gradually acquired practical skills necessary for adult life. A child who could contribute to household work became valuable very quickly. Breakfast was simple. It was not a meal designed for enjoyment. It was a meal designed for energy. Porridge was common. Bread was common. Sometimes there might be butter. Sometimes cheese. Sometimes preserved meat. Fresh fruit depended heavily upon the season. Colonial diets varied greatly throughout the year. Winter often reduced available choices. Summer provided abundance. Spring could be difficult. Historians sometimes refer to the period before harvest as a hungry season. Food supplies occasionally became scarce. Families carefully managed stored grain and preserved foods. A poor harvest could create serious problems. After breakfast, Thomas prepared for work in the fields. The farm required constant attention. Modern agriculture relies heavily on machinery. Colonial agriculture depended largely on human and animal labor. Tasks that take minutes today often required hours. Plowing provides a good example. A modern tractor can prepare large areas of land quickly. An 18th century farmer relied on horses or oxen. Progress occurred slowly. The work was physically demanding. Weather added another layer of uncertainty. A storm could damage crops. Drought could reduce yields. Unexpected frost could destroy plants. Nature exercised tremendous influence over daily life. As Thomas walked toward one of his fields, sunlight finally spread across the countryside. Morning mist drifted above the grass. Birds moved through the trees. Insects hummed softly among wild plants. The landscape appeared peaceful. Yet survival here required effort. Every fence needed maintenance. Every structure eventually required repairs. Every field demanded attention. Colonial farmers lived in a world where neglect carried consequences. Ignoring a small problem often allowed it to become a large one. Thomas paused near a fence. One section had been damaged. Perhaps an animal had pushed against it. Perhaps weather had weakened it. Either way, it needed repair. He examined the broken rails. Wooden fences stretched across enormous portions of colonial America. Building them consumed vast amounts of timber. A single farm might require thousands of feet of fencing. Keeping livestock contained was essential. Animals wandering into crops could destroy weeks of work in a single afternoon. Repairing the fence would occupy part of the morning. Thomas retrieved tools. Hammering echoed softly across the field. Nearby, a horse grazed calmly. The sky had become bright and clear. It promised a pleasant day. Good weather always lifted spirits. Many farmers watched the sky constantly. Weather forecasts did not exist. People relied upon experience, observation, and tradition. Some believed animal behavior predicted storms. Others studied clouds. Others relied upon sayings passed down through generations. Not all of these methods were reliable. Yet they reflected humanity's long effort to understand nature. By mid-morning, the fence was secure again. Thomas wiped sweat from his forehead. The day was warming. Summer work could be exhausting. Colonial laborers often spent long hours outdoors. Shade became valuable. Water became important. Rest occurred when possible, but not always when desired. As he looked across his land, Thomas saw evidence of years of effort. Fields cleared. Fences built. Structures maintained. None of it appeared suddenly. Everything represented accumulated labor. The farm itself was a record of countless ordinary days. Days much like this one. Days rarely remembered by history. Yet history depends upon them. Nations are built not only by famous leaders. They are built by farmers, carpenters, blacksmiths, mothers, children, workers whose names seldom survive. And on this quiet Pennsylvania morning, Thomas Miller continued adding another ordinary day to that long and mostly forgotten story. Part 4: The Silent Settlement. The morning of August 18, 1590, began with cautious optimism. For Governor John White, it was a day he had imagined countless times during the previous 3 years. Ironically, it was also his granddaughter Virginia Dare's 3rd birthday. As the English ships drifted toward the familiar coastline of Roanoke Island, White could hardly contain his excitement. He pictured Eleanor standing near the settlement, shielding her eyes from the sun as she watched the ships approach. He imagined Virginia running beside her mother, now old enough to speak and laugh. He imagined farmers proudly showing their harvests, carpenters displaying stronger homes, and children who had grown up in the new world. Every delay, every storm, every failed expedition, every sleepless night, it had all led to this moment. But something felt wrong. The shoreline remained strangely quiet. No signal fires burned. No boats paddled out to greet the ships. No smoke drifted above the forest. No church bell echoed across the island. The silence was unsettling. White tried to reassure himself. Perhaps the settlers were working inland. Perhaps they had not yet noticed the approaching ships. Perhaps everything was perfectly normal. The anchors dropped. A landing party gathered. Armed sailors stepped into small boats and began rowing toward the beach. White could barely wait. The closer they came, the stranger everything looked. Nature had begun reclaiming the shoreline. Grass grew where people had once walked. Young trees stood in places that had been open ground only 3 years earlier. There were no fresh footprints in the sand. No recently repaired docks. No fishing nets drying in the sun. Only wind and silence. The men reached the beach. Every sound seemed unnaturally loud. The creaking of leather belts. The splash of boots against shallow water. The clatter of muskets. No human voices answered. White hurried inland toward the old settlement. The familiar paths still existed, though many had nearly disappeared beneath weeds and brush. Branches scratched against clothing. Birds scattered through the trees. Then they saw the fort, or what remained of it. The wooden palisade still stood, but much of it had collapsed. Several buildings were gone entirely. Others had partially fallen apart after years of exposure to rain, wind, and storms. The settlement looked abandoned. Not recently abandoned. Long abandoned. White rushed from one building to another. Eleanor. His voice echoed through the empty clearing. No answer. Virginia. Nothing. He searched every house, every storage building, every corner of the fort. The homes were empty. Furniture had disappeared. Tools were missing. Food stores were gone. There were no cooking pots left behind. No clothing. No personal belongings. The colony had not been destroyed. It had been packed. Almost everything useful had been deliberately removed. This immediately caught White's attention. If the settlers had been attacked suddenly, many possessions would likely have remained scattered throughout the settlement. Instead, the houses looked as though families had calmly gathered their belongings before leaving. That observation would later become one of the strongest pieces of evidence in the mystery. As the search continued, one sailor shouted, "There is something carved here." The men gathered around a large wooden post standing near the entrance to the abandoned settlement. Deeply carved into the wood was a single word, Croatoan. The letters were remarkably clear. They had not been scratched hurriedly. They had been carefully carved with sharp tools. White immediately recognized the name. Croatoan referred to both an island, known today as Hatteras Island, and the indigenous Croatoan people, who had previously maintained friendly relations with the English settlers. Suddenly, White remembered the agreement made before he left. If the colony moved, they would carve their destination. If they were forced to leave because of danger, they would carve a Maltese cross beside the message. White looked carefully. No cross. Not on the post. Not nearby. His heart began to race. Perhaps they had simply relocated. Perhaps they had joined their Croatoan allies temporarily while waiting for supplies. Perhaps everyone was still alive. For the first time that day, hope returned. The sailors continued searching. On another tree, only the first 3 letters remained visible. CRO. The rest had weathered away. Again, no cross. Everything suggested the same conclusion. The settlers had chosen to leave. But why? And when? The search continued until sunset. No graves. No skeletons. No abandoned weapons. No signs of a violent battle. No burned buildings. No evidence of massacre. Everything seemed to point toward an organized departure. Yet the island itself offered no answers. White insisted they continue searching the following morning. Unfortunately, nature had other plans. That night, powerful winds swept across the coast. The sea became dangerously rough. Heavy rain lashed the anchored ships. Small boats could no longer safely reach shore. Captains feared losing entire vessels if they remained anchored near the outer banks. The coastline was notorious among sailors. Hidden sandbars shifted constantly beneath the waves. Countless ships had already been wrecked there. White begged the captains to sail immediately toward Croatoan Island. It is only there, he argued. The settlers left us a message. If they reach Croatoan, perhaps the mystery would end. Perhaps Alina and Virginia waited there even now. The captains initially agreed. Anchors were raised. Sails caught the wind. But before the ships could reach Croatoan, another violent storm struck. Huge waves crashed across the decks. One anchor cable snapped. Another ship nearly grounded on a sandbar. Experienced sailors warned the captains that remaining in those waters risked total disaster. Reluctantly, the decision was made. They would abandon the search. John White was devastated. He pleaded. He argued. He begged. But he possessed no authority over the privately owned ships. The captains chose survival. The fleet turned east. Slowly, painfully, the American coastline disappeared behind the horizon once again. John White stood silently on deck. His eyes remained fixed on the fatting shoreline until it vanished completely. He never returned. The governor of the lost colony spent the remainder of his life wondering what had become of his daughter, his granddaughter, and the other colonists. History never records another meeting. His final journal entries reveal both sorrow and hope. He believed the absence of the Maltese cross meant the settlers had not fled in panic. He believed they had reached Croatoan safely. He desperately wanted that conclusion to be true. But without another expedition, he could never know. For nearly 2 centuries afterward, the mystery faded into the background of colonial history. New settlements were founded farther north. Jamestown survived. Plymouth was established. Eventually, 13 English colonies spread across the Atlantic coast. The lost colony became little more than an old story told by historians. Yet the unanswered questions refused to disappear. What happened after John White left? Did the settlers integrate into indigenous communities? Did disease gradually reduce their numbers? Did they move inland? Did some survive for decades? Or did another tragedy unfold beyond the reach of history? Centuries later, archaeologists, historians, anthropologists, and forensic scientists would begin searching for answers hidden beneath forests, sand dunes, ancient villages, and forgotten maps. The greatest investigation into America's oldest mystery was only beginning. End of Part 4. Part 5, Clues Buried Beneath the Sand. John White never saw his family again. He died believing that somewhere beyond the Atlantic, his daughter Eleanor, his granddaughter Virginia Dare, and the other settlers might still have survived. His journals ended with hope rather than certainty, but after his death, there was no one left who had actually known every member of the lost colony. For years, England was occupied with other priorities. New colonies were planned. Wars continued across Europe. Trade expanded. Attention shifted toward another settlement that would eventually become famous, Jamestown, founded in 1607, 20 years after the Roanoke colonists disappeared. Yet Roanoke was never completely forgotten. Stories spread among sailors. Merchants repeated strange rumors. Explorers occasionally claimed they had heard of white men living among Native American communities far inland. Most of these stories were impossible to verify. Some were clearly exaggerated. Others remain intriguing even today. One of the earliest clues appeared in the writings of William Strachey, an English secretary living in Jamestown. While gathering information from indigenous leaders, Strachey recorded stories suggesting that several English settlers from Roanoke had survived for years after the colony disappeared. According to these accounts, some colonists had been accepted into native communities and had lived among them before later conflicts claimed their lives. Modern historians continue to debate the accuracy of these reports. Were they based on real events? Were they misunderstood translations? Or had the stories changed as they passed from one generation to another? No one can say with certainty. Still, they offered something historians desperately needed: a possibility. Another important clue came from John Smith, the famous Jamestown leader. During his travels through Virginia, Smith spoke with numerous indigenous leaders. One powerful chief, Powhatan, reportedly told him that people resembling the Roanoke settlers had once lived among neighboring tribes. Powhatan even claimed that some had later been killed because rival communities feared cooperation between English settlers and local nations. Smith took the stories seriously. But once again, there was no physical evidence, no graves, no written records, no surviving colonists, only testimony passed through translation between very different cultures. As decades passed, the mystery grew. Children in colonial America heard stories about the lost colony. Travelers searched abandoned islands hopping to discover forgotten ruins. Treasure hunters imagined hidden settlements deep inside forests. Writers transformed historical uncertainty into legends. Some even claimed Virginia Dare had survived and become a mythical figure living among the forests. These romantic stories fascinated readers, but had little historical support. Professional historians preferred evidence. Unfortunately, evidence remained extremely limited. Then, more than 300 years later, archaeology began changing everything. During the 20th century, scientists started excavating Roanoke Island with modern techniques. Unlike treasure hunters, archaeologists worked carefully. Every broken pottery fragment mattered. Every rusted nail mattered. Every animal bone mattered. Layers of soil became historical records. Each discovery revealed another small piece of the puzzle. Researchers uncovered remains of English buildings, iron tools, ceramic fragments imported from England, glass beads once traded with indigenous communities, pieces of armor, lead shot from firearms, copper objects, cooking utensils. Every artifact confirmed that the colony had indeed existed exactly where historical records described. Yet one thing remained strangely absent: human remains. If the settlers had died at Roanoke in large numbers, archaeologists expected to discover graves. They found remarkably few. That absence strengthened one important theory. Perhaps the colonists truly had left the island. During the 1930s and 1940s, historians began paying closer attention to the mysterious word carved into the post. Croatoan. It had always been treated as a clue. Now researchers asked a different question. What if it was not merely a clue? What if it was the answer? Croatoan Island, today known as Hatteras Island, lay roughly 50 miles south of Roanoke. Unlike Roanoke, the Croatoan people had remained friendly toward the English. Governor White himself had trusted them. If the settlers faced food shortages, relocating there made practical sense. The island offered fishing, fresh water, existing alliances, a better chance of survival. Could the entire colony have moved there peacefully? The theory seemed increasingly reasonable, but historians needed proof. Beginning in the late 20th century, archaeologists expanded excavations to Hatteras Island. The work was slow and demanding. Wind constantly shifted the sand. Storms damaged excavation sites. Centuries of erosion had transformed the landscape. Even so, important discoveries began appearing. Researchers uncovered 16th century English artifacts inside areas once occupied by Croatoan communities. Knife handles, gun parts, metal tools, ceramic fragments, a writing slate. These were not ordinary trade goods. Some objects appeared to belong to English families rather than soldiers. That distinction mattered enormously. Families carried household possessions. Military expeditions carried weapons. The artifacts suggested English civilians might indeed have lived alongside indigenous neighbors. Still, the discoveries were not conclusive. Trade alone could also explain some objects. Historians remained cautious. Then another astonishing clue emerged. In the British Museum, scholars carefully re-examined one of John White's original maps. At first glance, it appeared ordinary, but modern imaging technology revealed something hidden beneath a small patch of paper. Someone, possibly White himself, had covered part of the map. Beneath the patch, a tiny symbol representing a fort. The hidden fort lay inland, far west of Roanoke Island. The discovery shocked historians. Had White secretly planned a second settlement? Had the colonists moved there after he departed? Or had officials intentionally concealed the information for military reasons? No one knew. But suddenly, the search area expanded dramatically. Researchers launched new archaeological investigations at locations connected to the mysterious map. One excavation site became known simply as Site X. Almost immediately, archaeologists uncovered English pottery dating to the late 16th century. Additional metal objects followed. Fragments of storage jars, imported ceramics, signs that English people may have visited or perhaps even lived there. The discoveries made international headlines. Yet once again, the evidence stopped short of providing certainty. Had a few explorers traveled there? Or had the entire lost colony relocated inland? The debate intensified. By the beginning of the 21st century, historians generally agreed on one important point. The traditional idea that every colonist had been suddenly massacred on Roanoke Island was becoming less convincing. The archaeological evidence simply did not support such a catastrophe. Instead, the evidence increasingly suggested movement, relocation, adaptation, survival, at least for some time. But where exactly had they gone? To Croatoan, to the mainland, to several different indigenous communities, or perhaps To all three, the answers remained hidden beneath centuries of soil. Yet science was advancing rapidly. New technologies, including DNA analysis, ground-penetrating radar, isotope studies, and advanced archaeological surveying, would soon allow researchers to investigate questions that previous generations could never answer. For the first time in more than 400 years, the lost colony mystery seemed closer than ever to being solved. End of Part 5.